The rain hadn't stopped for 3 days when the woman slid into the booth across from me and said, "You buried the wrong girl, Mr. Whitlock." She set a photograph face down on the table between my coffee and the salt shaker. "Everything about the night your daughter died is in this folder." I should know. I'm the one who walks out of that river alive. I'm Harold Whitlock, and I'd spent 26 years convinced I'd already lived through the worst day a man could survive. I was wrong. The worst day was still coming, and had walked into Dempsey's diner, wearing a wet raincoat, and my dead daughter's face. Let me back up. For 31 years, I worked as a claims investigator for an insurance company out of Cincinnati. People think that job is boring. It isn't. You spend 3 decades watching people lie to you about fires they set, cars they pushed into lakes, injuries they faked, and you develop a sixth sense for it. You learn to watch the hands. The eyes don't lie as much as people think, but the hands always do. A liar's hands never know where to rest. I retired at 63. My wife Maureen had passed 2 years before that, and the house got too quiet to sit in, so I took to coming down to Dempsey's most mornings. Same booth, far corner, the one by the window where the vinyl seat had a tear someone had patched with duct tape. I'd order black coffee and the 2-egg special, and I'd spread out my old files. Cold cases. Nothing official, nothing anybody paid me for. Just things that had never sat right. Habits like that. You don't shake them. They're the closest thing to company a man like me has left. But there was one file I never brought to the diner. That one stayed at home, in the bottom drawer of my desk, under a stack of Maureen's old recipe cards. The file on my daughter, Caroline. She was 22 when she died. November of 1998. She'd been driving home from the State University up in Columbus, late in a storm not unlike the one we'd been having that week. The bridge over the Maumee gave way under the weather, or so they told me. Her car went into the river. They recovered the vehicle 4 days later, half a mile downstream, wedged under a fallen sycamore. They recovered a body 2 weeks after that. The water and the time had done what water and time do. The coroner matched dental records, and that was that. We buried her on a grey Tuesday with maybe 40 people in the cold, and I came home and I never opened that file again. Couldn't. Some doors a man keeps shut because he knows what's behind them. So when this woman sat down and said the name Caroline, without me ever telling her one word about it, my hands went cold around that coffee cup. "Who are you?" I said. I kept my voice flat. Old reflex. Never let them see you flinch. She turned the photograph over. It was Caroline, younger than the day she died, maybe 17, sitting on the back steps of our old house on Linden Avenue with our golden retriever, Biscuit, sprawled across her lap. I knew that photo. There was a copy of it in the file in my desk drawer. Maureen had kept the original in her wallet until the day she died. "My name is Renee," the woman said, "but that's not the name I was given at birth. The name I was given was Caroline Whitlock. I'm your daughter, Dad. I'm going to be honest with you about what happened inside me in that moment, because if I tell you I was suspicious, I'd be lying, and I spent my whole life chasing liars, so I won't become one now. I wanted it to be true so badly I could feel it in my teeth. I looked at her face. The years stack up on a person, but bones don't change much, and the bones were right. Same wide-set eyes Maureen had. Same little hook in the nose that Caroline got from me. I found myself doing the math without meaning to. 22 plus 26. She'd be 48 now. The woman across from me looked to be right around there. "That body in the ground," I said. My voice didn't sound like my own. You buried Diane Foss," she said. "She was a friend of mine from the dorms. She'd been driving my car that night because hers wouldn't start. I'd loaned it to her. I wasn't even in the vehicle." She leaned forward and her eyes filled up. "They told me you knew. They told me you'd identified another girl on purpose to collect the money. That's why I never came home. For 26 years I thought my own father had let me be declared dead so he could cash a life insurance policy." I sat there with my mouth open like a man who'd been struck. "That's not," I started. "There was no policy. Caroline, there was never any." "I know that now," she said quietly. "I found out 6 months ago, and I've been trying to find the courage to come tell you ever since. I don't remember finishing my coffee. I don't remember paying. I remember her hand on my arm in the parking lot, the rain on both of us, and her saying, "I have so much to tell you, Dad," and me, 65 years old and shaking like a boy, saying, "Then tell me all of it. We've got time now. That was my first mistake. We did not have time." That was my first mistake. We did not have time, and I, of all people, should have been watching her hands. She told me she'd spent the missing years in Arizona, then New Mexico, working under a name a man had given her. The man, she said, had pulled her out of the river that night, told her family had abandoned her, and kept her close out of what she'd believed was kindness. It took her decades to understand he'd kept her the way a man keeps a dog on a chain. She'd finally gotten out, she said, finally pieced together the truth, and the truth led her back to Ohio, back to me. I brought her home. God help me. That first night I made up the bed in Caroline's old room, the one Maureen and I had never been able to bring ourselves to change, and I sat on the edge of it, and I cried like I hadn't cried at the funeral. 26 years of grief don't drain out of a man clean. They come out in pieces, and some of the pieces have edges. For the first 2 weeks, it was the closest thing to happiness I'd felt since Maureen died. Renee. I kept trying to call her Caroline, and she'd flinch, so we settled on Renee. Cooked dinner. She asked about her mother. She cried when I showed her Maureen's grave. She remembered things. She remembered Biscuit the dog. She remembered the swing set in the backyard. She remembered the shipped blue mug Maureen drank her tea from every morning, and when she said that, I had to leave the room. But you spend 31 years watching the hands, and even when your heart is begging you to look away, some part of you keeps watching. The third week, she started talking about the trust. I should explain. When Maureen passed, she left an estate. We'd been careful people, no children left to spend it on, or so I'd thought, so most of it sat in a trust I'd set up, conservatively invested, the kind of thing my generation does because we lived next door to people who remembered the Depression. It came to a little over $2 million. I lived off the interest and Social Security and didn't touch the principal. I'd half decided to leave it all to the Children's Hospital downtown. Renee didn't ask about it directly at first. She came at it sideways, the way the clever ones always do. A comment here about how hard money had been out west. A story there about a business opportunity. A friend of hers, a restaurant venture in Scottsdale that just needed a little start-up capital. Sure thing, guaranteed returns. She'd mention it, then drop it, then mention it again a few days later, a little more urgent each time. And then one evening, she sat me down at the kitchen table and asked me very directly whether there was a way to move some of Mum's money to me now, while you're still around to enjoy seeing me have it instead of waiting. I said I'd think about it, and that night, lying awake, the old sixth sense started whispering at me, and I hated it for it. Because here's the thing, nobody tells you about being lied to by someone you love. It isn't that you don't see the signs, you see every one of them. You just argue with yourself about each one until you've talked yourself out of the whole pile. That's how it gets you, not through blindness, through hope. But I'm a stubborn old man and have it won out over hope. The next morning I drove down to the public library and I pulled up the news archives and I looked for the accident. November 1998. The Marmee. And there it was. And there, in the third paragraph, was a name I'll never forget. The second passenger. Because there had been 2 girls in that car. The article named my Carolyn as the driver, and it named the passenger, recovered from the water that same night, alive, treated for hypothermia, and released. Her name was Diane Foss. Diane Foss. The girl Renee had told me was the one we'd buried. I sat in that library a long time, a real long time, because there were only 2 explanations. Either the newspaper was wrong, or the woman sleeping in my dead daughter's bed had told me a lie so specific, so detailed, so cruelly precise that she'd handed me the name of the survivor and called her the corpse. A liar gets the broad strokes right and the details wrong. I'd built a career on that. I drove home with my hands steady on the wheel for the first time in 3 weeks, because a steady hand is what you get when hope finally lets go. I didn't confront her. You don't confront a liar with what you know. You let them keep talking and you watch where they walk. I called an old friend, a retired detective named Pruitt, who used to feed me information back when our jobs overlapped. I asked him to run the name Renee had given me, the Western alias, and the man she said had taken her. Took him 4 days. When he called back, his voice was careful in the way that tells you the news is bad. "Harold," he said, "the woman in your house has a record going back 20 years, 3 states, elder fraud mostly. She finds widowers, men with money and dead wives and dead kids, and she becomes the kid. There's a whole network of them. They buy backgrounds, photos, family details off people. Obituaries are a gold mine for these folks. Your wife's obituary mentioned Caroline by name, mentioned the dog even. Some of those old write-ups, they put everything in." I sat down hard on the kitchen chair. "There's more," Pruitt said. "She's not working alone. The man you're describing isn't her captor. He's her partner. Goes by a few names. They run this together, and Harold, 3 of the men they've done this to are dead. Heart attacks, falls, 1 car accident. The kind of deaths nobody looks at twice on a man in his 60s or 70s who's just signed his money over." I'd like to tell you I felt rage. I didn't. Not yet. What I felt was cold and clear and very, very old. The feeling of a man who has been a fool and who has just been handed the chance to stop being one. That night at dinner, I told Renee I'd decided to give her the money. I watched her face when I said it. I watched her hands, and there it was, that flicker, that little settling, the look of a player who's just seen the cards fall her way. She reached across the table and squeezed my hand and said, "Daddy, you don't know what this means." And her eyes were wet, and she was good. She was so good that if I hadn't sat in that library, I'd have squeezed back and meant it. "I'll need to set up the transfer with my attorney," I told her. "Friday. He'll have papers for you to sign." "Of course," she said, "whatever you need." What she didn't know was that the man I'd been meeting Friday wasn't only my attorney. I called Pruitt back, and Pruitt called a man he knew at the FBI field office in Cincinnati, a younger agent named Okafor, who'd been building a file on exactly this kind of crew for 2 years and had never been able to get a victim to play along. Because that's the trick of it, the thing that lets these people operate. By the time the Mark figures it out, he's too ashamed to call anyone. An old man doesn't want the world to know he handed his life savings to a stranger who called him Daddy. He'd rather lose the money and keep his pride. They count on that. They build their whole rotten business on the shame of lonely old men. I decided I was done being ashamed. Agent Okafor came to my house on a Wednesday while Renee was out. She'd taken to going out most afternoons, to make calls she didn't want me hearing, I imagine. He sat at my kitchen table, the same table where she'd asked me for $2 million, and he laid it out plain. They had enough to want her badly. What they didn't have was a clean recording of her, in her own words, claiming to be my daughter and asking for the money. While accepting it, with that, they could roll up the whole network, the partner, the people forging the histories. All of it. "We're not asking you to do anything dangerous," Okafor said. "We're asking you to do what you are already going to do Friday. Sign the papers. Let her take the bait. We'll be there." I asked him one question. "The other men, the 3 who died. Will this, what I'm doing, will it make it so there's no fourth?" He looked at me steady. "Yes, sir. It will." "Then I'm in," I said. I want to tell you the next 2 days were easy. They weren't, because here's the part nobody who hasn't lived it will understand, even knowing what she was. Even with Pruitt's file and Okafor's photographs spread out in my mind, when Renee came home that night and made my coffee the way I like it and laughed at one of my dumb old jokes, some piece of me still wished, still ached toward the lie, because the lie was the only place my Caroline was still alive. The truth meant burying her all over again, and this time burying the fantasy along with her. I lay awake Thursday night thinking about Maureen. about how she went to her grave, still hoping, still keeping that photo in her wallet, still flinching at the phone every time it rang, late at night, for 16 years. And I thought, if there's one thing I can do for you now, Maureen, it's make sure no other man's wife dies the way you did, hollowed out by a hope somebody else turned into a weapon. Friday morning, I put on my good shirt. The one I wore to Maureen's funeral. I don't know why. It felt right. My attorney's office had a conference room with a long table and a window looking out over the river. That same river, miles downstream, the one that had started all of this 26 years before. Renee and I sat on one side. My attorney, a good man named Pruitt had vouched for, sat on the other with a folder of papers thick as a Bible. In the next room, behind a wall, Agent Okafor and 3 others sat with headphones on and a recorder running. In my breast pocket, over my heart, a little device I'd been shown how to switch on with one finger. I switched it on while I was sitting down. Now, the attorney said, before we transfer the funds, I just need to confirm a few things for the record, for the trust documents. You understand, given the amount. Of course, Renee said. She dressed up too. She looked, God forgive me, beautiful. She looked like Maureen at that age. State your full name, please. She didn't hesitate. Caroline Whitlock. And your relationship to Mr. Whitlock. I am his daughter, his only child. She smiled at me. He thought I was dead for 26 years. But I came home. And you're requesting the transfer of the trust assets in the amount of $2,100,000 voluntarily into an account in your name. Yes, she said. Daddy wants me to have it now, while he can see me enjoy it. Isn't that right, Dad? She turned to me, and I looked at her, at the eyes that were almost Maureen's, at the bones that were almost Caroline's, at the hands folded so steady and so sure on that table, and I felt the last of the hope go out of me like a pilot light. That's right, I said. The door to the next room opened. I won't dramatize what came after. There were no guns waved, no shouting, just 3 people in plain dark coats, and Agent Okafor saying her name, her real name, which I'd learned by then, and which I will not repeat here because it doesn't deserve to be remembered, and reading her the charges. Wire fraud, identity theft, conspiracy, and, once the others fell, the deaths of 3 old men in 3 states, which would take longer to prove, but which they would prove. She didn't cry. That was the thing that told me, finally, completely, who she really was. The crying had all been a tool, and the tool wasn't needed anymore, so she set it down. She just looked at me, and her face went flat and empty as the river, and she said one thing. You're going to die alone now, old man. You know that. You had a daughter, and you let them take her away again. And here's the strange part. The part I've turned over 1,000 times since. She was wrong, and she was right. Wrong, because within a month they'd arrested her partner in Albuquerque, and the forger in Tampa, and a woman in Kansas City who ran the obituary mining, and 4 other men got phone calls from the FBI telling them the women in their homes were not their daughters or their nieces or their late brother's kids. Phone calls that, I have to believe, saved at least 1 or 2 of their lives. I sat with Agent Okafor when he made one of those calls. I heard the silence on the other end. I knew that silence. I'd lived in it, and I thought, that's worth something. That's worth more than $2 million. That's worth more than my pride. But she was right about the other thing. I do go home to a quiet house. I am an old man, alone, and the bed in Caroline's room is strict and empty again, and some nights the quiet is so loud I can hardly stand it. Here's what I've come to, though, sitting in that quiet. My daughter died in 1998. That's the truth, and I dressed it up in a stranger's face because I couldn't bear it bare. The woman who called me Daddy didn't give Caroline back to me. She rented out my grief and charged me $2 million for the lease. And she'd have charged me my life if I'd let her. What she preyed on wasn't my stupidity. It was my love. They always do. That's the cruelest thing I learned, and I learned it late. The very thing that makes you a good father, a man who'd give anything to hold his child again. That's the exact thing they sharpen into a knife and slide between your ribs. So if you're out there and you're alone, and someone shows up one day knowing all the right things, saying all the right names, wearing a face that's almost the one you lost, I'm not telling you to harden your heart. A hard heart is just another kind of grave. I'm telling you to watch the hands. Call somebody. Call a friend. Call the police. Call a man like Pruitt. Call anybody. Before you sign one single page. The shame of asking is nothing. Nothing. It heals in a week. The other thing doesn't heal at all. I keep the real photograph now, the one from Maureen's wallet, framed on the mantel where I can see it from my chair. Caroline on the back steps, 17 years old, the dog across her lap, squinting into a sun that's been gone a long time. I talk to it some evenings. I tell her about my day. I tell her I'm sorry it took me 3 weeks to choose her, the real her, the gone her, over the comfortable lie. And I tell her this every time because it's the only prayer I've got left that I believe in. I couldn't save you, sweetheart. But I made sure of one thing. Whoever did this to us is never going to do it to anybody else's little girl again. That's not justice. There's no justice for what was taken. But it's the closest thing a foolish old man could build out of the wreckage. And most mornings now, that's enough to get me down to Dempsey's, into the corner booth, where I order black coffee and I watch the door, not hoping anymore, just watching. The way I should have been all along. The hardest thing I'd had to sit with isn't that a stranger fooled me. It's that she almost didn't have to lie very hard at all. Every door she walked through I'd already left open for her. 26 years of grief had hollowed out a space in me, shaped exactly like a daughter, and Renee simply stepped into it. That's the part I keep turning over at night. The con didn't work because I was stupid. It worked because I loved Caroline so much that I'd have paid any price, believed any story, to have one more day with her. Love left the gate unlocked, and somebody walked right in. But here's what I've learned, and I want you to hear it from an old man who learned it the slow, expensive way. The thing that saved me wasn't suspicion. Suspicion alone just makes you bitter and lonely. What saved me was that when the doubt finally came, I didn't argue it away to protect my comfort. I got in the car, I drove to that library, I looked at the truth even though the truth meant burying my girl all over again. That's the difference between a man who gets ruined and a man who gets free. Both of them feel the doubt. Only one of them is brave enough to go check. And checking takes more than nerve. It takes a clear head. 31 years of watching people lie taught me to look at the hands, to chase the detail, to know that a con man always gets the big strokes right and the small facts wrong. Renee handed me the name of the survivor and called her the corpse. A heart that only wanted to believe would have missed it. A mind that kept itself sharp caught it. So keep your mind sharp, even when life tries to dull it with grief. Read. Ask questions. Pick up the phone and call somebody before you sign anything, ever. The shame of asking for help passes in a week. The other kind of ruin never leaves. Then there's the steel it took to go through with Friday. To sit across from that woman, knowing what she was, and let her say, "I'm his daughter," one last time, so the recorder could catch it. I'd be lying if I said part of me didn't still want the fairy tale. But I thought about Maureen, and the 3 old men already in the ground, and the 4th man who might still be saved, and I held the line. That's the whole of it, really. Be good enough to care about strangers you'll never meet. Be smart enough to see the trap, and be tough enough to do the right thing, even when it breaks your heart a second time. I couldn't bring Caroline back. No one could. But I made sure my love stopped being a weapon they could use, and started being a shield for somebody else's father. That's the best a foolish old man can do, and most mornings now it's enough.